My name is Jonathan from Hindenburg with the wonderful Jeff Towne of Transom. Jeff, my first question, how did you get into this world in the first place? Can you tell us just the broad arc of Jeff?
I had the unusual circumstance of being able to sort of dabble in radio back when I was in high school. My high school had a little 10-watt FM broadcast station in the school that, especially as time has gone by, I've come to realize that absolutely nobody listened to, even my friends. And so, some friends and I would do radio shows in this high school thing. But I finally realized that no one at all was listening, but thankfully we were deluded to think that we were actually real DJs. After graduating from college, some people that I'd met at WXPN, John DiLiberto and Kimberly Haas, had been doing a documentary series called Totally Wired, where they were going around the world and interviewing people in electronic sound, innovators in electronic music primarily. And they had started a new program for public radio in the United States called Echoes. And it turns out they needed some help. And so they sort of had like, hey, would you like to work with us on this? And it seemed impractical at the time, but then as I investigated a little bit, going like, okay, wait a minute, they're offering to pay me to do what I like to do in my spare time. And in the course of doing that program, it's largely a music program. We put together a show, playing music from CDs and, now downloads or whatever, recorded music. But we also interview musicians, and we also do live performances with musicians. And so in the course of producing the show, which is 2 hours a night, 5 nights a week, and so kind of a pretty frantic production schedule, and we're a fairly small crew, I really get a taste of a whole lot of the different edges of music production in terms of just banging out a 2-hour show of music, recorded music, but also interviewing people, editing and producing those into fairly concise, highly produced interview segments. In terms of those tend to be maybe 10 to 15 minutes long, with narration and excerpts and music beds and music examples and things like that. And so it's not just a straight Q&A. And so there's a lot of production involved in those interview segments. But in the course of doing all of that, once again, it's like, I've kind of learned a lot of edges of music production.
So you're, especially back in the day, behind the board recording, maybe that's very different now, but if you're doing like recording a band with a drummer and all that stuff, can you talk about just the difference between setting that up versus recording like a conversation as we're doing now, or other things? Like, if you didn't know about it and you're getting into this, maybe you're in a podcast, something, what is it like?
Back then, just because it was for practicalities reasons, we would record live to stereo. And so we would just show up, and even if it was a group with drums and multiple instruments, if we could keep it under 16 channels, it was like, and we were just kind of forced to keep it under 16 channels. We would just mic everybody up. And looking back on it, I'm kind of amazed at how good those concerts sounded. I mean, they really turned out very nicely. That, again, it helps to have a lot of practice just in being sort of forced into that situation. Now, as time has gone by, it's nice to have the options. As time has gone by now, even in the fairly basic situations, I will now digitally multi-track either into a recorder or into the computer or both. And so we've just done a few recently, and I'm thrilled that I'm able to have, again, for relatively controlled things, if I could keep it under 8 channels, I have a Sound Devices MixPre 10T that gives me 8 excellent microphone inputs in a bag that I could carry over my shoulder. And so I could just sort of wire that up and do a basic rough mix. It's not quite as sophisticated as going through a mixer. Again, adding effects and things like that is not really practical, but I can at least track it. I can track it live to that machine, and I'll often record onto that machine and also hook it into the computer and just run a backup into any kind of computer programming. And incidentally, the last thing I did, I recorded into the MixPre 10T and also ran a Hindenburg session, just because, again, I wasn't doing anything fancy. Hindenburg is not really designed for music production, but if I'm just tracking, it's like it's nice and stable. And so I ended up at the end of the session, I had everything recorded onto the MixPre's memory cards. and also onto my computer at the same time. And so I immediately just went in and started working on the Hindenburg session, because it's like, well, it's already in there, so I might as well. In this case, I didn't have to do any fancy engineering, and so the Hindenburg was just fine. Now, ultimately, for other projects with like larger band projects, I'll probably end up in Pro Tools, just because I need to do aux sends and groups and things like that
Sure.
are more music based. It's just not what Hindenburg is designed for.
What is the difference between other DAWs, like it could be Pro Tools or whatever, and Hindenburg from your experience?
Yeah, well, no, that's an excellent point. Where it's like, I mean, and I mean, I still do it now, and it's kind of funny, but especially at any kind of sort of, again, radio or audio gatherings, it's like, I feel like I should have a T-shirt printed up just saying, it's like, I'm not being paid by Hindenburg, but it's just kind of true. It's like, I mean, I am just very enthusiastic about the program, because again, to give a little background, once again, we were really at the dawn of the DAW doing the Echoes production. In that, when we first started out, we were actually multi-tracking to half-inch analog tape, and so once again, we were producing the show to multi-track analog tape, and then mixing it down to DAT and sending the DAT off to an uplink to get it sent to stations. And that was a very tedious process. And so as soon as DATs came out, as DAWs came out, sort of digital audio workstations came out, it's like we just jumped on it, because we could see that that's exactly what we needed. And again, and that was in the very, very early days, where there was like Studer Diaxis, and we Pro Tools was in its infancy at the time. I'm not sure it was even, might have just been Sound Designer when it first came out. I'm not even sure it was called Pro Tools initially. We ultimately went with Sonic Solutions, which was a very expensive and very sort of esoteric program, which interestingly enough was designed kind of more for mastering than for like music production. I actually really loved working in Sonic Solutions, but it was a very expensive program. It was a little finicky. You had to use very specific expensive hard drives and things like that. And eventually they just sort of fell behind with just basic processing things that we found we needed. And so eventually we toggled over to Pro Tools, and we're doing the show in Pro Tools. But for many, many years, sort of longtime DAW users are probably aware that Pro Tools basically had a real-time bounce for many, 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 many years. And so it's like, once you put your multi-track session together, if you wanted to bounce that session out, it went in real time. And so me doing a 2-hour long radio show every day, I can't tell you how many evenings I spent at the studio white knuckling the desk, hoping that the bounce was going to go properly, because it very often would go to an hour and 45 and then stop, and I would have nothing, and I'd have to start it again. And it was incredibly frustrating. Now, obviously,
I don't miss any of those days.
Yeah, right.
Any of it.
Now, there were a few clunky workarounds for that, but ultimately it was just a very sort of frustrating process. But I was looking at various alternatives. But honestly, when I first came across Hindenburg, I had actually never imagined that we would do Echoes in Hindenburg, just because when I first encountered it, it sort of seemed like, oh, this is a very clever program that's really good for new producers that are not especially technically adept. And that's obviously that's whole sort of raison d'etre, and just sort of be for the non-technical person. And so I wrote it up for Transom, because that's part of Transom's mission as well, is to get people into storytelling that aren't necessarily accomplished engineers or super experienced people. So it seemed like absolutely perfect for the Transom environment, in terms of like, here's a way to get people in and recording and producing and putting together relatively sophisticated productions without a whole lot of technical knowledge. But as I was working with it, as I was reviewing it, I just kept going like, well, that's awfully clever. And well, that's awfully handy. And well, that's kind of efficient to do it this way. And it suddenly occurred to me, like, well, let me just try doing my 2-hour radio show in this. And I just discovered that a lot of the very just sort of basic structural processes of Hindenburg, of the auto leveling, of your inputs, that used to just drive me crazy, take me a huge amount of time to get individual recorded tracks to even levels, to get the dialogue at even levels, get the dialogue and the music evened out, all that kind of thing was suddenly really, really super simple and good sounding in Hindenburg. And so all of a sudden I was going, wait a minute, I think I can do my radio show not only faster but better. Like it's coming out sounding better than doing it in other Pro Tools, because just sometimes you might as well let the machine do things that machines are good at, and doing things like that, like being able to do a quick analysis and doing a loudness normalization on a file. That was not routine in other DAWs now, and it's a little more common these days, but that was an unusual thing at the time. And so just sort of putting together the show suddenly became much more efficient, and suddenly realized going, oh, okay, that's a good thing. And then it took us a little while to transition because, as I mentioned, our interview features are fairly complex in terms of just with a lot of music beds and music posts, and like just a lot of dense crossfades and things like that. And so we sort of stayed in Pro Tools for a little while with that. But then again, I had a similar sort of revelation that one time, I don't remember what the circumstance was. I was like, well, let me just do this in Hindenburg because I needed to. And suddenly realized, like, going, oh, wait a minute, I can do this just as well. Maybe better, maybe faster in Hindenburg, that I really thought I needed a real flamethrower of a DAW, of something like Pro Tools, like that was a real, high-end professional production device. And in the end, I realized, like, no, I'm actually getting better results and working faster and better in Hindenburg. And I'm at a point right now where simply the existence of the clipboards in Hindenburg have spoiled me so much that I just don't know if I can produce in another DAW in any
This
sort of
new
efficient
stuff
way.
to spoil you coming too with the clipboards, actually.
Well, right.
Yeah.
Well, exactly. And I was going to say, I think there's several things coming down the pipe, I think, that are going to be very exciting. But it's one of these things where just, and again, as I show it to people now, once again, even fairly sophisticated producers that are very set in their ways, a lot of times if I sort of show ways to use the clipboard, that all of a sudden people are like, oh, wow. And it's like, it is sort of amazing to me that kind of workflow is not inherent in other machines. And hopefully I hope other programs do adopt it, because it's so incredibly useful. And so
honestly, I say, like, I use other DAWs for other things, music stuff. And I had the exact same experience. The clipboard is probably the feature for me personally, where I'm so used to doing that if I was in another DAW, like I want to just put a clip somewhere, like, oh, I have to like hide a track or like put it. It's like, can I just put the thing in here and then grab it when I need it? And Pro Tools has like a list of every clip. So if you make a cut, it makes a new clip, and etc. It's not the same in how that works. And it's like, anyway, it's a little different. Your check's in the mail, by the way.
That quickly, just, I mean, I feel like any other programs, like very quickly, like their quote unquote bin of clips, just very quickly gets confusing and cumbersome. And, and I've seen people with fairly clever ways to work around that, but none of them are as good as just organizing your clipboards properly. And none of them have just like, this is a silly thing, but for instance, just doing a 2-hour radio show every single day, any kind of efficiency is always appreciated. And so, for instance, what I do, it's like, and especially now in sort of COVID times, but it's not too different back when we were all together in a studio. But now I'm working from home by myself, and the senior producer of the program, who's the narrator and the host of the show. He's recording himself in his own studio, and he just sends me a file, and I deal with the file. But ultimately, my workflow is, for instance, the narration. I just get one big file with all the narration for the show, but that just needs to get broken up into like 25 different little chunks. And so I'll go through and just clean up that narration and, pick up any false starts or cut together any discontinuities, level it out, make sure everything, get rid of mouth noises, things like that. But then I'll end up with a whole bunch of little clips that I've grouped together. And then it took me a little while to figure it. And actually, I honestly can't remember whether, again, I just have a great time pestering Prayman about like, hey, wouldn't it be cool if this would happen? And then, every once in a while he'll go like, oh yeah, you just do this and it's already in there. Or there's been a couple of times that I've also been like, geez, it'd be really great if this did this. Then you'd be like, update your software. It does it now. And it's just sort of like, oh, well, kind of cool. But for instance, just the very basic thing like that I have, again, a narration that's made up of a whole bunch of little clips that are in a track. But now I literally highlight them all and use a short key just to throw them all into a bin in order in one step. that again, when I show this to other producers working in other programs, they're just like, wait, whoa, wait, what just happened there? And it's just like, I've just done my work, and now everything's in order in a bin, ready to go, and then I go back and put everything where it's supposed to be with short key, with hotkeys, and just sort of knock them in there, and it's just sort of like, people are sort of wait, you're not just sort of randomly dragging. It's like, no, I'm putting these precisely where they want to be. And also, again, I don't know
It's
that
gonna get easier. I promise.
Oh,
it's gonna get easier as of
I have
soon.
I have no doubt.
Yeah.
And I also, and again, this is a specific thing for my need, but it just coincidentally the way that my radio show goes. It's a 2-hour long radio show, but the practicalities of being out a nationally syndicated show is that individual radio stations don't really want a single file. They want it broken up into little individual segments so that they can do a bottom of the hour cutaway, and they can do a news cutaway perhaps, and so our show is formatted with like a 1-minute billboard at the top of the hour, and then there's a 5-minute chunk that a station could drop and cut away to live news, and then there's a segment that goes to the bottom of the hour, and then it stops, and so they can insert a local promo at the bottom of the hour if they want. Then it goes back to the top of the hour, but gives them room to do another promo before the top of the hour, and then does the whole thing over again for the second hour. So ultimately I need to upload 13 discrete segments just to allow stations to throw it in their automation and be flexible with it. And so once again, this just, when I was working in other DAWs, I would have to I would bounce out a coherent program, and then I'd open in another program in a destructive editor and chop it into pieces, which just ended up being a little better than sort of doing these individual bounces. But with Hindenburg, I literally just lay chapter markers down, and again, with a single keystroke, it just spits out exactly what I need at precisely the right levels, and so it's always exactly the right length with exactly the right level, and it's just like such an incredible load off my mind compared to how I used to have to do it with other software. So once again, I mean, as you mentioned, I still have Pro Tools on my computer, and I use it for music mixing if I'm doing a multi-track session with a band or something like that, because that's the appropriate tool for the job. But when I'm making a radio show, whether if it tends to be like an interview based feature with, again, a narrator and maybe a Q&A, or certainly a narrator, and then actualities from the interviewee with illustrative music examples or ambience or whatever. I can't picture a better model than the way Hindenburg works. It's like I've gotten to a point where I'm so used to that I just do it like that, and when I'm occasionally forced to use another program, I'm just like, I'm sure it's not just habit, but it's just like, well, I can do it, but boy, it's so clunky now. And so, and again, now it's one of those things, as I know, you've hinted a little bit, and it's one of those things that I'm not paid by Hindenburg, but I do respect the fact that it's like, I mean, I actually was a little frustrated for a while, because it's like I was aware of some super cool things that it was capable of doing, and it still wasn't doing it. But I appreciate the fact that they were like, no, it's not quite right. No, it's not quite right yet. No, it's not quite right yet. And so the fact that they're not putting stuff out that's like quirky and buggy and like, well, it's sort of how it kind of works. Now, again, I get the impression that there's some of that cool stuff is actually working now, and that's going to be very exciting.
The goal of Hindenburg is to make everything very accessible for people, because if you don't know much, or you can't really talk about float, it doesn't really have any bearing on the story that you're going to tell. But some part of the technical things can still be overwhelming for folks. So I'm going to ask you to do something that's essentially impossible. But I wondered if you could just demystify a couple of these features for people. Basically, the difference between bit rate and sample rate, and where things need to be set, or what are industry standards for those things, making it easy for folks who don't know so much.
No, absolutely. And now it's like, some engineer, gave me the sort of, kind of entertaining phrase one time. It's like, yeah, the beautiful thing about standards is you can have so many of them. And that's one of the problems, is that it's like, there's never one sort of stable standard. And to be honest, I still, to this day, I'm slightly mystified as to why there ended up being sort of these two camps early on of sort of quote unquote professional audio being standardized at 44.1 sample rates, in terms of if you had CDs were had 44.1 kilohertz sample rates, whereas digital video standardized at 48. And they're functionally the same. And I'm always kind of have to catch myself laughing every once in a while. People going, "Oh no, I always do it at 48 for the better sound quality." And like, it's indistinguishable sound quality between 44.1 and 48. But it's just sort of like, well, again, what are you doing if you're producing for video? If you're going to be interacting with the video world, then it certainly makes sense to stay at 48. Most recorders now can record, be it software or a hardware field recorder, can record at higher sample rates. That's now available. That's not simply the toggle between 44.1 or 48 kilohertz, which were chosen very specifically because there's a phenomenon called aliasing, that when you're making a digital signal, you end up with some weird noise sort of way up in the higher frequencies, and it's related to how many samples per second you're taking. And so, as it turns out, those like 40,000 samples per second, 40,000 and above, allowed the engineers to put a digital filter just a little above 20,000 hertz, which would knock that aliasing noise down. And basically our human ears can't hear above 20,000 hertz anyways. And me being an elderly person, I can't hear anywhere near close to 20,000 hertz now. So I'm certainly down in the teens somewhere. But it's just one of those things where these higher sample rates, now it's quite routine to see, 88 or 96, 128. And I think that's still up for debate. And I personally still don't tend to use those higher sample rates personally, especially when I'm out recording in the field, because at least for radio production, for audio production, I'm not finding that useful. Now, if I was going to make a record, in particular, if I was going to make a classical music record or some like acoustic music, very delicate, detailed music, I might record at those higher sample rates in a studio. Basically, it allows you to capture higher frequencies, which I think there's a reasonable question as to what's the point of recording higher frequencies if we can't hear them. But at the same time, I think there are people I trust who just abstractly say, it just sounds better. And it's like, I suppose I can believe that. But for practical purposes, still going out in the field and recording, I still recommend people, if they're recording an interview or even like a live performance or something to be used ultimately for a radio program or a podcast, 44.1 or 48K is really sufficient, because your final production is going to get dumbed down to get broadcast or to get streamed, as a podcast file or a data file or any kind of streaming audio. It's losing a lot of audio quality in the end. Now, I'm a huge advocate for trying to start out with as high quality audio as you can, and wait till the very last process to dumb it down, to sort of to make it more efficient to deliver. And so when you're recording out in the field, I always encourage people to not record MP3s or not record any kind of compressed audio file like that. Record a WAV file at 44.1 or 48K. You're
talking about file compression.
File compression. Yes, I'm sorry. Yeah,
folks, right, which is of course compression, but some folks mistake that with a compressor in DAW or music and that kind of thing. So can you just talk about what you mean by it loses some going from a WAV to an MP3?
The idea of file compression is a matter of like, a WAV file or an AFF file, but basically like a PCM audio file that, again, is as close to possible to the original audio. It's pretty big. So some very clever engineers came up with some algorithms that they figured out how to throw away certain aspects of the audio file and make a smaller data file that still sounded pretty close to the original. And so the more audio you throw away and the sort of smaller your file gets, the more artifacts you get and the sort of less similar it is to the original. But it's actually kind of alarming how much you can throw away and it still sounds close enough that a lot of people don't care. Hence, podcasts tend to be MP3s or AIFFs or AAFs. I'm sorry. It's like I actually use AAF, but just because I like the sound of the encoding a little better. But it's just one of these things where Similarly, if a radio, an FM radio broadcast, once again, is bandwidth limited, and so first of all, it's distributed as an MP2, which is again sort of like a flavor of an MP3. It's a compressed file, but just less compressed than the MP3. And so basically, almost everything that you're doing in a practical sense, if you're making a radio program or making a podcast or putting a file up on your website to stream or anything like that, it's going to probably end up being compressed. Now, once again, there's some talk occasional, especially in the music world, about offering high resolution files for distribution finally, and maybe ambisonic surround files, and we'll see if that comes to fruition. But for right now, practically speaking, if you're making a radio show or a podcast, you're probably going to end up sort of with a compromised final product. But you want to sort of wait until the very end if you can. You want to record in the field your original at as high a resolution as is practical, just because if you continually multiply compress data compression, if you keep throwing away little bits of audio at multiple stages, then your sound can really fall apart. 16-bit is really sufficient if you've engineered it carefully. That's really enough room to give you a difference between, again, very quiet sounds and very loud sounds in a practical sense in terms of what our ears can handle, what our stereo systems can handle. That's really enough. Now, that being said, 24-bit gives you more dynamic range, and so it basically lets you record quieter sounds with appropriate resolution that you can still hear those and distinguish those, and then gives you more room in terms of handling louder sounds. And so the amount of dynamic range that a 24-bit signal, if it's engineered correctly, really exceeds our capability of hearing. And so that really ought to be sufficient. 24-bit should be sufficient for any kind of practical audio work that we're doing. Now, what's interesting is, again, the engineers have come up with what's now being called 32-bit float, and so there's two things happening there. One, 32-bit, just by the math that we're talking about, 24-bit gave you more dynamic range than 16-bit, so therefore 32-bit would give you more dynamic range than 24-bit would. But it's the float part that actually is really the dramatic thing. If you record in 32-bit float in the field, you can capture really anything that you would encounter in nature in terms of a very, very quiet sound and a very, very loud sound will all be encoded properly, and you won't have to worry about did your signal clip on the way in, because clipping happens if you've got too loud of a sound coming into your recorder and it just can't handle all that much volume. And then again, older recorders and even current recorders at 16 or 24-bit, if you record really, really, really quietly, then you have to turn it up later in your digital workstation, and that's going to bring up a lot of noise. And so it's not really ideal. So the fact that these 32-bit recorders can actually record a good amount of detail down in the very, very quiet sections, and so you can just turn it up in your DAW and it comes back and sounds great. And similarly, if you have something really, really loud, you can just turn it down and you get it back into a range that's usable, but it's not distorting. It's kind of amazing.
A practical consideration for folks might be,
yeah,
are you realistically recording a butterfly's wings flapping next to a bus honking and need to hear them both?
Yeah. So do you need, because the reality of the situation is, if you have a good recorder and you've set your levels carefully, 24-bit is lots of dynamic range. And so you should be able, you can do it fine at 24-bit. That being said, for instance, I decided to see, okay, what's a use case that might be, might need this kind of thing. And I realized this comes up occasionally. I thought, let's say you need to record gunshots for some reason. It's maybe it's something that's happening, or maybe you're just doing a story about a shooting range or something like that. So I found an outdoor shooting range, and I went up there and I recorded with a couple different recorders. There's this little Zoom F3, which again is amazing, like this little tiny thing with 2 XLRs and no, hit record and go. There's no input controls. There's also this little Zoom, it's the F2, and it's got basically a little mini input. It comes with a lavalier, but you can plug a different kind of mic in there if you want. Or there's this Tascam X8 that, once again, built-in mics does that. Or I have the MixPre 3, the MixPres, and the Zoom F8 also will do that. And I discovered two interesting things. For one, is that yes, in order to encode something like that, especially, I mean, if you're recording somebody talking, and then there's gunfire, even in the distance, that's so loud that indeed you need a lot more dynamic range than your typical 16 or 24-bit file is going to allow you. In order to make it listenable to people, you need to get it within a reasonable range of, like, what's practical for somebody to listen to. Get our, what is sort of pleasant to listen to is a relatively narrow range between what's physically possible of encoding. And so you want to get things within a reasonable level. And that's where the loofs come in, and sort of those sort of loudness units. Again, the FS is compared to full scale. So that's just the way we count them. So loudness units down from 0. And so 0 is like your absolute limit. And so the loudness units, and again, the standard tends to be, in most places for broadcast, somewhere between -23, -24, depending on where you are. And they're, basically indiscriminate. That, once again, that's looking at an average level. So the average level of your sound, if you have it around there, then it's going to be pretty listenable and still have enough dynamic range that it'll sound natural, that you can get louder and you can get softer, and it'll still sound pretty normal. Whereas, once again, if you've recorded something at an extremely high bit rate, you might have something that's way too loud or too soft, and you're going to need to regulate that. You're going to need to go in and manually adjust the level of the clip, and or maybe apply some processing, like use compression or limiting. That's going to basically do that automatically. It's going to respond to the audio file and just sort of make those differences between the loud and soft a little bit more even. And so if you do that by using the loofs display and or a target of loofs, or you can output at a certain loofs level, that everything is going to be, again, at an average level, so it's going to sound even. So, like, again, that loudness units are meant to sort of simulate how our ears work. And so if you have everything at a fairly consistent loofs signal, no matter what number you choose, for what it's worth, in the podcasting world, as I made the joke before about, it's so great to have some standards because there can be so many. There's not really a standard for podcasting, except it sort of seems that somewhere between -18 or -16 has become a standard for podcasting. That's a little loud, in that it doesn't give you that much dynamic range anymore. So the difference between your
too,
yeah,
like
yeah,
the higher the number, what am I saying? The higher the number, the louder it is.
Actually, the lower the number. Yes, right.
Yeah,
because we're counting backward from 0. Yeah. So no, it doesn't make any sense. But so 16 -16 loofs is louder on average than -24 loofs, and so it's just one of those things. But I think, it's been chosen because so many podcasts just generally are somebody talking, and so you don't really need so much dynamic range for that. Whereas people that, like, you again put those standards in at -23 and 24, we're keeping in mind that maybe you're doing a musical program. Then, like, I'm in a circumstance, I'm uploading my shows to PRX, in this circumstance, as a distributor sending these files around to the different radio stations, and I have to hit -24 loofs with my files or they'll reject them. And so it's just one of those things where, because ultimately those files are just going to radio stations, and the reality is now many radio stations are just dropping those files into an automation system, and an engineer may never touch them again. So I have to make sure that they're at the proper level, that they'll sound good on this radio station. The radio station doesn't want me sending them files that are too quiet or too loud. And the same sort of thing, if you're making a podcast, it's probably good. And again, and for instance, I do my radio show at -24, but we do have podcast episodes, and I put those out at -16 just because I realize that, like, that's kind of the standard. And so if somebody's listening to a whole bunch of podcasts in a row, mine's not going to be too quiet because I engineered it at -24, because I'm a nerd for greater dynamic range. I sort of wanted to fit in with it. So if people are listening to a series of podcasts, they're not jumping all over the place in volume.
That is going to wrap it up for us.
Cool. Well, thank you very much. Thanks for having me, and great to chat with everybody. And Hopefully it was informative or useful or interesting in some way.